we are in a circumstance where things can matter, right? Consciousness is the condition in which things can matter, where there can be a range of experiences, some of which are very, very bad. If the word bad means anything, they're bad. And some of which are very, very good, if the word good means anything. And we are navigating in that space. We can't help but navigate or seek to navigate in that space.
Right, absolutely.
And religion is one form of conversation about that navigation problem. And I would argue
let's go back to the ideal.
Often diluted one.
Well, Jordan rolls his sleeves up.
Bad girl.
He means business now.
Bad girl and Catwoman are approximations to a higher ideal. That's what they are.
And to return to this with a biblical idea, I'm fairly sure from personal experience that a lot of parents are perfectly content with bringing their children up vaguely within the story they've inherited. And at some point, the children realize that the fairy doesn't bring them money when their teeth fall out. And at some point, maybe around the same time or a bit later, they discover that Santa Claus doesn't really come down the chimney. And at some point, they realize that actually the whole religious thing is a kind of metaphor, but it's got them through the formative years in some way, often with terrible damage along the way, I concede that, but also with something else. And I'm struck by the number of people, and this is why I share some of what I think is Jordan's concern about the possibility of the world you're envisaging, which is, I can think of a lot of parents now, in my country and other countries as well, who I'm just very struck. They themselves are kind of baby boomer or 60s atheists, humanists, whatever. And I start to notice, for instance, that they're enrolling their children in Christian schools. And I say to them, why are you doing this? And they have fairly coherent arguments along the lines of the one I've just had. Look, I don't particularly believe this myself, but I think it's a pretty good way to bring up the kids. It's a structure of a kind. And I'm not sure, I can find all sorts of flaws in that. But enough people are doing it that it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, well, I would say yes. It speaks to a real failure of imagination and effort in the secular community to produce truly non-embarrassing alternatives.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is across the board. This is not just school. This is how do you conduct a funeral? How do you get married? You know, all of the what rites of passage can you offer a 13-year-old?
What are you doing here? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Just to be the first people in history to have absolutely no explanation for what we're doing at all. Is a big moment.
Yes.
And
that's the.
That sharpens up my concern perfectly, because to shrink back from that moment and resort to one of the pseudo stories of the past, I consider to be a failure of nerve, both intellectually and morally.
So let's go back to the superhero idea. One of the things you might notice about superheroes is that some of them are actually deities. Right, so in the Marvel pantheon, you have Thor, for example, and so there's a very thin line between the idea of a superhero and the idea of a god, especially if you think about it in a polytheistic manner. So the modern superheroes and the Greek gods, for example, share a tremendous number of features in common. And so here's something to think about. So there's a reason that people admire superheroes, and it's because they act out parts of the hero archetype. That's the technical reason. They're obviously acting something out because that's how you can tell they're superheroes. They share some set of characteristics across the set of superheroes that makes them superheroes. Now the question might be, what is the essential element of being a superhero that makes you a superhero? And the answer, the way that was solved historically, is that as polytheistic societies developed, and that was usually a consequence of isolated tribes coming into contact with one another, they each had their separate deities. And then over the course of time, those deities warred in actual wars with people, but also conceptually. And out of that polytheistic framework was extracted something that was vaguely monotheistic, as all of those cultures came together to try to determine what their highest ideal should be. So that's the God of gods, that's a way of thinking about it, or the King of kings, that's another way of thinking about it. And that's an implicit ideal. And you could make the case that there's nothing more...
Tell that to the Hindus. You tell that to the Hindus. I mean, we've got 1.2 billion people, or maybe it's 1.4 now, who are operating in a religiously saturated system that does not conform to that ideal. There is no one on top of it all.
Well, there's still associated.
Arguably, there's three on top of it all, but
there's still an attempt to generate that polytheistic, to integrate that polytheistic reality underneath a single rubric, or you have nothing but continual dissociation of the culture. And I'm not saying this is necessary.
That's a pretty good description of what's going on in India at the moment.
Well, I'm not saying that this is inevitable either. And there is a tension. The problem, this is Nietzsche's observation, and Mircea Eliade as well, the problem with extracting out the highest God from the panoply of gods is the ideal becomes so abstract that it disappears. That's the death of God. And Eliade has tracked that phenomena over multiple cultures. It's not something that's unique to the West. So the danger of that abstraction is that it gets too abstract and disappears and leaves us in the situation that Douglas just pointed out.
Can I throw us back to the key, issue of Elton John's glass, which you came up with the other night? Because there's something I wanted to add to that. If perhaps you'd explain why I said Elton John's glass just now.
Well, it came back to this question of what makes something valuable, and I used as an example in Vancouver on one of those nights. If I had a glass here, which I said was actually it was the glass that Elton John used the last time he played in this theater, suddenly it seems to be a more valuable glass. And then Jordan and I argued about just what the status of that value was. I don't know where you want to take this, but yeah.
Well, it's just one thing in particular, which is that the whole issue of what it is you give value to, and let's say that glass was demonstrated for a time to having been drunk from by Elton John at his final concert or his latest farewell tour, whatever.
Yes.
So that's already a glass with some meaning. Let's say that over the years, the whole attribution of that glass becomes debatable. But over a long period of time, a lot of things are going to have happened around it, and to stretch this to breaking point, possibly. Let's say at some point people lose their lives over whether that is Elton John's glass or not. Well, let's say that people start to lose blood.
Let's not just say that. Let's recognize that is the world we're living in with respect to other religions.
So the problem is that we end up, when we're talking about religion, it's the same thing when you're talking about land. You're not just talking about any inherent worth. You're talking also about the worth of things people have given up for this.
Yeah.
And so we end up giving the layers of things. Well, no, it's more than that. We inherit more and more layers of the meaning because other people before us have given that meaning to it. So that by the time you have this object, it's an object of worth, even if it's of no worth in itself at all, but because of the amount of worth that people before you have given to it. And that seems to some extent what we're doing with the religion discussion.
Yes.